So in this chapter of my series of videos in preview of Chris Eubank Jr versus Conor Benn, we're going to be taking a little look at the IBO World Title. What better time to get into this belt when coming up we've got one of the richest non-world title fights in boxing history, between two guys who have never even been a world champion in the past, as most people would say. But Chris Eubank Jr is a 3-time IBO world champion, a former 2-time IBO super middleweight champion, and he is the current IBO middleweight champion. So for those who do recognise the IBO title, then this middleweight fight between Chris Eubank Jr and Conor Benn is a world title fight then, right? Well, here's what Conor Benn had to say at the second launch press conference for this upcoming fight.
Chris, you fought for the IBO World Title in a leisure centre. Shut up, man. You're an idiot. You fought for the IBO World Title in a leisure centre. That's like your greatest accomplishment.
I've won the IBO 3 times.
And do you know what? I got offered it, and do you know what? I turned it down. It ain't a legitimate world title.
Okay.
It's hard, it may be hard for you to hear.
Now, I'm not too sure whether Conor Benn means that he was offered for the belts beyond the line for this upcoming bout and then turned it down, or if he means that he had turned down a chance to fight for the IBO welterweight title in the past. But the IBO middleweight title is indeed not on the line for this fight on Saturday, as per BoxRec at least. However, going back to when Conor Benn finally had his big step-up win against Sebastian Formella back in 2020, over 4.5 years into his pro career, this was his big flex about that win.
How happy are you with the improvements that you're making behind closed doors?
Bro, I just beat a former world champion who went a distance with Sean Porter. Bro, I just beat a former world champion.
Yeah, Formella is a former world champ, a former IBO world champ, and it was over a year after the Formella win when Conor Benn defeated the former WBO world champion Chris Jr. So for the first 5 years and 8 months of Conor Benn's pro career, his biggest flex was a win over a former IBO world champion. But 5 years and 8 months into Chris Eubank Jr.'s career, he was a defending IBO world champion, having won the belt off of the reigning champion Reynold Quinlan and boasted a title defence against the acclaimed Arthur Abraham. So it's funny that, innit? That's not me being some Eubank Jr. fanboy trying to act like he's had some legendary career. I'm just pulling out receipts in response to Conor Benn's words at that press conference. Which brings us on to the broader topic. What is the deal with the IBO then? Seems as if it's a token belt for people to either credit or discredit when it suits them. But why is its credibility so subjective? So the IBO World Title, or shall I specify, the International Boxing Organization World Title, is a fringe world title outside of the titles of the main 4 recognised world governing bodies who all recognise each other in the WBA, WBC, IBF and WBO, the 4 belts required to become the undisputed champion in the modern 4-belt era. The WBA derived from the NBA, the National Boxing Organization, which was around since 1921. The WBC was formed in 1963, the IBF was formed in 1983, deriving from the USBA, and the WBO was founded in 1988. Now, much like the WBO, the IBO was also founded in 1988, interestingly enough, even though they didn't start introducing belts until 1992. But comparisons to the WBO are pertinent when it comes to the IBO World Title. When it comes to the whole recognised or not recognised thing, the WBC and WBA were both recognised as legit world titles from the start of their respective existences. And out of the 3 governing bodies that formed in the 80s, the IBF, WBO and IBO, only the IBF were recognised as legitimate pretty much from the off, with the reigning lineal heavyweight champion of the world Larry Holmes giving up the WBC belt and holding the IBF heavyweight title as his lone governed world title. But the WBO now, it took them 19 years to get fully recognised and for their belt to be required to be an undisputed champion. The WBO had varying levels of legitimacy in certain regions and under certain promotional banners or broadcasters in its early days in the late 80s and 90s, shall we say. And they gained world recognition in the early 2000s, being recognised by the WBA in 2000 and being recognised by the WBC in 2004. The latter of which made the WBO really legitimised in world boxing, mainly America. And in 2004, when the unified or then undisputed WBC, WBA and IBF champion Bernard Hopkins defeated Oscar De La Hoya for his WBO belt in a unification fight of sorts, Hopkins became the first man to hold all 4 of the now big 4 belts at once. And some boxing fans will credit Bernard Hopkins as the first ever 4-belt era undisputed champ. Yes, he was the first guy to hold all 4 of those belts at once, the 4 belts now required to become undisputed. But the WBO were not recognised by the IBF until 2007, and that was the final piece of the puzzle in regards to the full recognition of the WBO. So the WBO was not required by a fighter to become the undisputed champion until the year 07, as Zab Judah and Corey Spinks both held the WBC, WBA and IBF welterweight titles without holding the WBO belt after Hopkins' win over De La Hoya and prior to 2007, and they were both considered undisputed welterweight champions. So yes, it took until 2007, that's 19 years into their existence, for the WBO to be fully recognised. But as a 37-year-old company, that means they've now been recognised for 18 years. But the IBO now, they're also 37 years old. And with 37 years of no recognition by any of the big four still to this day, it is fair to say that they will never be recognised and will remain independent. And that's probably for the best. We don't want 5 belts to be required for undisputed status. Like, even if you like the WBO and how they operate, calling them your favourite organisation would be a sticky one, as their mere existence is why we are now in the 4-belt era. And although Hopkins held the WBO belt along with the big 3 back in 2004, as aforementioned, and Jermaine Taylor then won all 4 of those belts off of him in 2005, after the WBO belt actually being required for undisputed in February 2007, we did not get a 4-belt undisputed champ until August of 2017 in Terence Crawford at super lightweight. So technically, Crawford is the first ever undisputed 4-belt era champion, not Bernard Hopkins, and it took over 10 years into the 4-belt era for there to be an undisputed champion. So I say all that stuff about other governing bodies to establish the fact that the IBO title should not be recognised by the big 4 governing bodies. But on the topic of other bodies getting recognised, perhaps the IBF quickly gaining recognition and the WBO eventually gaining recognition is down to the fact that both of their founders were executives who broke off from the WBA, the oldest governing body of them all. But the IBO are fully independent and didn't break off from anyone. So with that quick gloss over of the entire history of governing bodies aside, pretty much, the IBO World Title is the GOAT of non-recognised world titles. We've had other ones in the past like the WBU title, famous for being held by both George Foreman and Ricky Hatton, but the IBO is the main unrecognised world championship, and it's the longest lasting one. The IBO are a governing body who actually do not enforce mandatories, and what they are pretty much known for doing for the most part is latching their belt onto champions who are already unified champions of the recognised governing bodies. And it does work for them, as the fighter won't complain about having another little pretty belt to hold along the others, and the IBO then get to give their belt some credence. Like when Lennox Lewis became undisputed champion in 1999, back in the 3-belt era, he would always flaunt his IBO belt alongside his 3 legitimate world titles. And in regards to the latching on thing, the IBO literally put their vacant heavyweight belt on the line for the undisputed title fight rematch between Lewis and Holyfield. And since then you've had other unified champions like Floyd Mayweather and Gennady Golovkin hold the IBO belt alongside their unified titles. Well, to be fair, Golovkin was only the WBA regular world champion when he fought for the vacant IBO title. So good little investment there from the IBO. And we've also got current unified and undisputed champions Alexander Usyk and Dmitry Bivol, who right now hold the IBO belt alongside their real world title, shall we say. But then of course, past and present, there have been a plethora of lone IBO world champions from across the world that we've never heard of and that most of you will never hear of. But in regards to lone IBO world champions, this creates those token world champions, going back to Sebastian Formella, who Conor Benn defeated and claimed that he had just beat a former world champion. And then you have the unique situation where a popular fighter is either not ready or possibly not good enough to fight for one of the big 4, but they can win this nice looking belt and wear it and call themselves a world champion, like Chris Eubank Jr himself, and like Prince Patel, who held the IBO bantamweight title as recently as 2024, but has since moved all the way up to welterweight, which is a curious case. But yeah, the IBO belt is not a proper world title when you look into its absence of mandatory enforcements and when you look into many of their lone champions, as in champions who only hold that belt and not legit world titles alongside it. But at the end of the day, it's really harmless, because we all know that it's not a real world title, and it is a nice looking belt for unified champs to hold along with the other gold. I would opine that it's actually better looking than all of the main 4 belts, perhaps bar the WBC belt, but let's not get into that debate. But as boxing fans, we look at it and we naturally rebuke it because we know of its illegitimacy. But like, if I were a drunken promiscuous woman dancing in the club, who was of course unaware of politics and boxing, but I saw a guy walk in with the IBO belt and everyone was saying that he was a world champion boxer, I would think he was the dog's nuts with that belt over his shoulder. Holding that belt would give you aura to anyone who is unaware of the politics around boxing sanctioning bodies, which is most people to be fair. And you could say that's harmful in regards to deceiving the casual boxing fan, but it's no worse than the main governing bodies having these international titles that look exactly like their full world title belts. And as for fighters who are not ready to challenge for the Big Four belts holding the IBO World Title, that brings me on to one of the current lone IBO World Champions in the IBO Super Lightweight Champ, Adam Azim. This is a case where people would say that the IBO World Title is on the same level as, or most people would say below the level of regional belts, such as British or European titles, and lower than the level of contender belts of the Big Four governing bodies, like your intercontinental titles or what have you. But Adam Azim's handlers in the McGuigans have pretty much admitted that Azim is not ready to step up and fight Dalton Smith just yet.
Put the fight on.
But Dalton Smith isn't even a world champ. He's merely in line to fight for the WBC Super Lightweight title. So how could Azim, as a world champ, not be ready to fight Smith yet? Well, of course, because it's not a real world championship that he holds. But funnily enough, when Chris Eubank Jr. himself first won the IBO Super Middleweight title in 2017, here's what he had to say.
Everybody, De Gale, Saunders, Golovkin, all these names, now they're all on my hit list. Now I've got the ticket to challenge these guys.
Interesting. So that means it was then merely a ticket to fight for the real world titles, as he saw it at that point in time, such as the then IBF Super Middleweight Champion James De Gale, who we mentioned. And that brings me on to another current IBO World Champion who only holds the IBO belt in Anto Kakachi. Kakachi was originally just the IBO Super Featherweight Champ, like he is again now, but as the IBO Champ, he did punch his ticket to fight the IBF Super Featherweight Champ Joe Cordina on the undercard of Fury vs Usyk 1 back in May of 2024. And this fight wasn't sold as a unification or anything really at the time. It was just Kakachi challenging for Joe Cordina's IBF belt. And Kakachi was a massive underdog going in against the real world champion Cordina. But Anto Kakachi absolutely battered Joe Cordina to become the new IBF Super Featherweight Champ. And despite defending his IBO title in that fight too, people wouldn't really call him a unified champ after that win, although he did look damn good holding the IBO and IBF titles together. So we know that it is possible for an IBO world champion to beat a proper world champ, but that's the same way that any British or European champ or even any challenger could step up and beat an actual world champion. So that doesn't prove the IBO title to be a legit world honour. But the difference with regional belts and the IBO world title is that the IBO one is called a world title, so you can hold it along with other world honours. And if you hold one other legit world title alongside it, you could give the illusion of being a unified world champion. And if you are actually a unified champion and hold the IBO belt alongside your unified belts, then you give the illusion of holding more world honours than you actually do. So Eubank Jr. was right with the fact that it can be a ticket, a little bit of a bargaining chip. But this is only true when you're a big name or have a big promoter anyway. Like Kakachi, he's promoted by Frank Warren, one of the biggest promoters in world boxing. But then you look to current IBO World Super Middleweight Champion, for instance, Osles Iglesias, if I'm saying that right. His IBO belt will hardly get him a crack at Canelo, will it? The unified champion of his division. And what is unfortunate for less popular fighters that hold an IBO world title is that holding the belt can hurt your rankings in the Big Four governing bodies. It doesn't always hurt your rankings as some people make out, as that Iglesias guy himself is ranked number 3 in the WBC's rankings, but it can hurt your rankings. For any fighter, not just less popular ones, but it is of course more harmful for the less popular IBO champs, as the more popular IBO champs could still negotiate their way to a big fight without fighting an eliminator and stuff, just like Kakachi did. And on Kakachi, I did say that he is now only a current IBO champ again, and he did not lose his IBF belt in the ring. After one defense of that belt against the acclaimed Josh Warrington, he was stripped of the IBF belt for not fighting his mandatory Eduardo Nunes. But Kakachi did not fight Nunes so he could have a big money fight with Lee Wood in Nottingham, and the IBO title will be on the line for that one. And that speaks to 2 points about the IBO. First, that its illegitimacy is reinforced by its lack of mandatories, as many fighters will get stripped of their belts for not fighting their mandatories, but they will keep their IBO belt, and that the IBO title is a token world title, as it now allows for Kakachi vs Wood to be sold as a world title fight, which isn't the worst thing in the world, as Kakachi vs Wood is a bigger fight than Kakachi vs Nunes. But to bring this back to the Eubank and Benn stuff now I called the IBO world title the GOAT of unrecognised world titles, but that's just of the ones that never did and will never go on to be recognised. As before the WBO got recognised, the WBO belt definitely held more prestige than the IBO title does now. Chris Eubank Sr. himself had only ever held WBO world titles, and that was before it was recognised by any of the other sanctioning bodies. And Nigel Benn's first world title was a WBO title. Eubank vs Benn 1 was for the WBO middleweight title. So in comparing Eubank Jr and Eubank Sr and talking about how much better Sr was, people would argue for that fact by saying Eubank Jr had only ever won the IBO title, which is not legit, unlike Eubank Sr who was really a world champion. And to argue against that by comparing that to Eubank Sr having only ever held the WBO belt, which was not recognised back then, would be a complete rewriting of history, as it's not the same at all. In the 90s, the British broadcasters, basically ITV then Sky Sports, fully recognised the WBO as a legit world title belt. And when Eubank vs Benn 2 happened, a unification for Eubank's WBO super middleweight title and Benn's WBC super middleweight title, this was seen as a world title unification fight, not as Eubank challenging for Benn's WBC belt. Like how Kakachi vs Cordina was seen as Kakachi challenging for Cordina's IBF belt. And although outlets like Sky Sports do recognise the existence of the IBO title today, a lone IBO champion will not be seen as a reigning world champion like Eubank Sr was as a lone WBO world champion back in the 90s. So despite the WBO not being recognised by the three other bodies, or by HBO over in the States back then, the main broadcaster,
WBO Heavyweight Champion of the World!
The title to which Michael Buffer referred in his pre-fight introductions is granted by an organization which is not recognized by HBO. So for our purposes, this is not a world championship bout.
when looking back at governing body history, the fact is that when the IBF and WBO came along, let's say, they didn't replace the WBC or the WBA. The number of belts went up every time. So back then, maybe the WBO were the extra little 4th world title, but the IBO would be the 5th world title if we are to hold them to any regard, which is a big difference to 4. So pre-recognition WBO and current day IBO are not the same. But in saying all that, as much as I have just proved that IBO world title's lack of prestige, not that anyone would debate against that, weirdly, I would have liked for Chris Eubank Jr.'s IBO world title to have been on the line this Saturday night, as again, it's so harmless, so why not? I picked Eubank Jr. to win this fight anyway, which would be a defense for him if the belt was on the line. But let's say Conor Benn does win, yeah? You know how he's saying he's going to go back down to welterweight after this fight and go for gold there? And I don't rate Conor Benn so highly, but the welterweight division is kind of weak right now and he can definitely beat Barrios for that WBC belt. So if Benn won the IBO World Middleweight title against Eubank Jr. before going back down to win welterweight gold, he can be cheeky and call himself a 2-weight world champion, previously doing the unthinkable and winning gold up at 160 before winning honours down in his own division. Obviously we'd all call bollocks on that, as the IBO world title isn't a real world title, but who really cares what the people say? We're just plebeians at the end of the day. And it's not as if the IBO belt on the line would take away from his win over Eubank Jr. if he does indeed win. Why not try to grab the nice little belt if you're going to be fighting the champion anyway? That's just my opinion, of course. But this close to the fight, it ain't going to change. The IBO middleweight title won't be on the line for Chris Eubank Jr. versus Conor Benn. But I better wrap up now. Trying to keep this one a bit shorter as we're so close to the fight now, and I'm going to try squeeze in one last pre-fight Eubank vs Benn video before Saturday. So please go check out all my other videos in this series before Saturday if you haven't already and if you do have the time. It's a good way to hype yourself up for the fight, as I've done some real deep dives into a lot of Benn and Eubank stuff. So links to all of those will of course be in the description. Leave your thoughts in the comments about the IBO title in the comments down below, and you have been listening to O.M.E Boxing.